So, let me introduce myself. I'm Kim Sunhye, Professor of Women's Study at Ewha Women's University. It was briefly explained, but we are talking about the race and gender. We started doing research since last fall. And in a way, instead of giving you discussions in a very systemized and well-organized manner, I just want to share with you our ideas that we have come up so far. So let me introduce myself. In the feminism debate or in the women's studies, we need to define the concept of race, what kind of approach we have been taken, and also how we have interpreted race and what kind of conflict or confrontations or discourse occurred so far. So 10 minutes is allocated to me, but of course I cannot represent women's studies in Korea, but rather purely based on my personal perspective and also based on my research, I'd like to share my own personal view. It's very difficult to put in one word what is the current status of the Korean gender, race definitions, and also the feminism itself in Korea. But rather, I'd like to give you the background so that we can all discuss and exchange our views. But for that, I believe that I need to give you a brief introductions about the context of Korea in the 2022. The feminism in the Korean society is one of the hot potato. The gender conflict sometimes can be defined as the ongoing feminisms, and media keep reporting this, and also in the online debate world we've been discussing about the emergence of another feminism. Ever since 2020, online world has emerged, and centering around media and online world, feminism has been mentioned several times. I'm sure that you are well versed in this. 2016, there was a murder happened in Gangnam stations. Right after that, feminism has been spread widely in Korea. This event, let me explain what happens. One of the female around in her 20s were brutally murdered in women's restrooms by male, and it gives a great resonance among the Korean society, and once again it was addressed as an issue of the feminisms. And once again, this is one of the most exemplary cases. In 1982, there was a book written by Kim Ji-young. 2016 was published. It was one of the best sellers in Korea, and it was regarded as a real textbook that defines the feminism. Even it was translated into 33 countries in different languages. Even it is now reproduced as the movie and also as a drama. Kim Ji-young, born in 1984, means that it represents a very average Korean female born in mid-1980 or exactly in 1982. What kind of life Kim Ji-young has experienced and who does Kim Ji-young represent? What kind of Korean female or Korean woman actually is and symbolize? So this story or this book represent Korean women. And during the keynote session, there was presentations about intersectionality in Korea. But in Korea, the feminism discourse and intersectionality, how the race were discussed. Let me put that first. Among the critics in the United States, based on that, the intersectionality has been developed, and also in Korea, in the study of the society, we are discussing about this as a methodology, as a theory. Intersectionality is widely being used ever since 2020. Once again, academia is very actively discussing the concept of intersectionality. For your reference, borderless feminism, written by Wanti and Patricia Qualty's book, were all translated in 2009 in Korea. So the public debate, as I mentioned before, as the feminism become more publicized, intersectionality of the feminism is sometimes explained or sometimes understood in a different aspect. Of course, this is very complicated because there was a lot of discourse, a lot of debate going on in Korean society, but simplistically, let me put it this way, as I mentioned before, the event, murder case in Gangnam stations and also N-room event was publicized. Telegram or messenger app was utilized to spread a sexual video that humiliated a female. And once again, this kind of event, once again, emphasize the importance of using media to be used illegally, and gender violence or also and GBV was widely publicized. So the target of Korean women, sometimes the target of the GBV and also the online critics, you can easily find that in the media. In the process, what are the issues of the women? What are the problems, the real situations that Korean women experience? Not only the biological issue of the Korean women, but what about the transgender women? Can they be regarded as a female or not? Once again, this is another matter of controversy. Illegal shooting of female. Sometimes women has been demonstrated in Ewha stations. At that time, only biological female could take part in the demonstration. It was proclaimed. Then what do we mean by biological female? What about the transgender? Once again, it imposes great importance. What about the transgender female? They are regarded not as a female, but as a human being that can pose a threat. So once again, this is a problematic. And feminism, if we discuss in a certain way, they can create a conflict. A medical feminism, what is it? During the past few years, within the Korean society, there was discourse about this, medical feminism. So among this debate going on, what about the transgender? Once again, transgender is regarded as the intersectionality, and political positions put a great emphasis on the biological feminism sometimes. And then what about the transgender issues? So the intersectionality feminism. So within the feminism theory, there are very complicated concepts and a more sophisticated discussion going on. But within the Korean society, more in a public way, in the public utilization way, the transgenders are now being used. Mnet is another event, which is a commercial channel, and one of the female rapper introduced herself as an intersectional female or feminist, which was quite interesting. And if you look at the subtitle, it talks about intersectionality, female or feminisms, but also the feminisms, when it is used with the intersectionality feminism, then they describe the feminist who not only has a great interest in gender, but also in the environment, in the society issues or other issues. So now the concept of intersectionality, how can we define that? How did it develop in Korea? Do we discuss about the race, or what about the gender? Sometimes the race issue is not very much centered on. So the concept of the intersectionality, it sometimes once again developed from the historical debate, like black female still feel discrimination as a black, as a female. Then the currently in Korean society, intersectional feminism, what's the perspective? How should we understand that? And what about the issue of the race? Why don't we discuss about the race? Why is the issue of the race is not visible? Why do we only talk about gender without race? What about the intersectionality gender? Does it really mean? Then what should we discuss? So this is the major questions that I'd like to pose. At the same time, what does it mean to say race in researching and teaching women's studies in Korea? Immigration has been addressed so far, and I guess based on this phenomena, we need to put more emphasis on the immigrations. We, in Korean society, the national is a homogeneous, but due to the immigrant, once again, Korean society is turning into a heterogeneous society. But the issue of the immigrant or the multicultural family policy, how did it progress? The through marriage, some of the immigrants got married to Korean men, and then there's a multicultural issues going on. Then they are not Korean born, but they are from other Asian countries. But patriarchy society itself is putting a lot of oppressions to these immigrant women who are suffering a lot. And then once again, the relationship between women's policy and also the multicultural policies, what is the mediations between these two. I'll give another example. As you know, Korea is notorious for the low birth rate and low fertility rate, and we have already entered into super aged society. And in a way, there were maternal health policy, but now the name has been changed into a different terminology, like gender support policies. Like all kinds of elements are encompassed related with reproductions, or all kinds of things are included. On top of that, immigrant category has been created. So you can see how important this immigrant issue is in Korean society. So the policy related with the immigrant policy seems like it has progressed a lot, but not really. Especially when you look at the women's policy, immigrant women policy is not categorized, but as a sort of another subcategory, it is regarded with a little importance on that. Then what about the identity of women? How it is expressed. We need to work on that. And of course, it has deepened, but when we talk about Korean female, what do we mean by Korean? And what about the non-immigrant Korean? So the Korean who are born in Korea, whose parents are born in Korea, what are their status? What about Korean women? What are their status? We need to think about that as well. So under this thing, Western-centered feminism and the debate on the race, what does it really mean? What kind of implication it has in the Korean society? The women's studies and feminism-related classes, a lot of students ask questions about the queer sexuality. They can easily find the connection regardless of the historical and national background of the article, whereas research on the race shows a pattern of the distance. And also, anything related with the race, we can hardly find that. Sometimes distancing, or sometimes the issues of race is not a Korean issue. It seems like, of course, not every single studies in Korea doesn't put any importance in the race. I didn't mean that, but Judith also tried to interpret the Korean race, and she talked about different kinds of the phenomena and the reality. But as a theory, race is sometimes mentioned by Patricia Collins, talked about American theory. So the race and gender, we need to have more diverse discussions, but is really race and gender our issue? Because race itself, only we discuss about the issue between the black and white. And sometimes the issue of the race, Korean society feel like it has nothing to do with the Korean society. And also the feminism, Western-centered feminism, or post-colonial feminism, or transnational feminism, do we really include Korea and East Asia as one of the important players? I don't think so, because we do have the Japanese colonial history, but we have never been colonized by Western society, but still colored feminism, can we really put it on par with race debate? Because when we talk about race, it's only between black and white. It's nothing to do with the colored people. Then race, how should we start discussions about that? Let me sum up. So let me pose questions again. The Korean women, what is it? Who are they? And we need to pose questions to define the Korean women. As Professor Chung Ga-young mentioned in her introductory remark, in the Korean society, 1 out of 10 Korean couple, they marry not Korean pure national people, but foreigners. And there are a lot of foreigners living in Korea, marrying Korean people. And 80% of the immigrants, they come from other countries trying to get married with the Korean people. So every day, the Korean women, Korean men, what are their definitions? Or 20 women in their 20s or male in their 20s. So here, the terminology of men and women, what are they really mean about? Then, what's the implications of nationals here in this debate? The women's studies in Korea or in studying women in the Korean society, we sometimes stereotype the concept of women too much. But instead of doing or coming up with a stereotype concept, we need to widen the boundary and we need to restructure the concept of the women. Of course, there were a lot of effort to reconceptualize the definition of women and men, but then how can we criticize that or how can we review this? What about the Korean women? What kind of women are we really talking about? What are the issues faced by Korean women? We need to reflect that again. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim Sunhye. You have given us some very interesting ideas about how we should deal with race and gender. We are slightly behind time, but the staff on site will let us know after 8-minute mark and 10-minute mark. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Kim. Now we would like to invite Dr. Lee Young-min from Ewha Women's University. Good afternoon. I study geography and ethnography at Ewha Women's University, and it's a great honor for me to be here with you today. I got involved in this project mainly because of my past research about multicultural phenomena of Korean societies. And it can be progressed further to how it is related with gender issues, but I have not had the opportunity to go that far. I have to continue to study to complement my studies in that regard. Today, I will mainly talk about racialism in Korea. In Western society, race or racialism is basically between white and non-whites, like blacks, mainly blacks. Such structure of racism results from colonial rule or subjugation during slavery, and the biological, physical traits. And that has constituted the concept or notion of race. And racism also includes discriminatory ideologies. Such racism of the Western society can be applied directly in contemporary Korean societies. 100 years ago, when Korea was opening up to foreign powers, Korea has been included in imperialistic globalization. And then under the racial hierarchy, the Korean people or the people of Joseon dynasty, what kind of status or level did they take in this hierarchy? And in this process, they developed the envy for white and discrimination against non-whites. In the Korean society, when we think about racism, there is also discrimination against migrant workers from other Asian countries or marriage migrants as well. There is a very unique racism that is found only in Korea. Among the same ethnic group, Joseon people or the expat people living in China called Joseon족, we are all Joseon족. We share the same lineage. We even have a book titled like that. But we still have discriminatory bias against Cho선족, like hatred of Cho선족. But relatively speaking, we are more compassionate toward Koryo-in or Chainichi or Korean diaspora living in Japan. Our attitude has been the non-interest. We have not been interested in the Korean diaspora in Japan, but Pachinko, the Korean drama, has become a good stimulant for us to be interested in Korean diaspora in Japan. And those Korean people who are returning to Korea, and we have hatred or discrimination against these returning people. I think similar trend can be found in Japan, like Japanese migrants to Brazil, Peru. They are called Nikkeijin, and there is similar hatred or discrimination against the Nikkeijins in Japan. Among the books that I have read, quote, there was Cho선족 living in the UK. It was a research about that. In the British society, discriminating Cho선족 is not what the UK people were doing. They were the Korean people. So Koreans were the only people who discriminated against the Cho선족 in the UK. So by having a in-depth research into such racism, we can identify how the unique racism in Korea is being constituted and how they are implemented. So it could be a sort of cultural racism in Korea. When we look at the diaspora from overseas, when they return to Korea, we tend to be discriminatory against them. Expats or diaspora are the Korean ethnicities living overseas. They are called 재외동포. 동 stands for the same ethnicity. So by this term, 재외동포 shows the extension of externality of Korean ethnicities. They are called Korean diasporas, and they are Korean nationalities or foreign nationalities. Those Korean people who have foreign nationality, that will be the criteria for dividing them. And those who return to Korea are becoming the target of discrimination in the Korean people. And we have a legal definition of such returnees. So there are various groups of diasporas in China, Russia, Japan, the US. So of course, these diasporas have developed unique characteristics. Already 8 minutes have passed. Especially the Cho선족 or Korean diasporas in China and Korean diasporas in CIS regions, they are often treated as the low-level class people, such as migrant workers, and they are considered as part of multicultural communities. And for example, let me talk about Cho선족. In the 1980s and 1990s, they began coming to Korea as part of their visit to their separated families in Korea. At that time, diasporas or expat, external part was emphasized, but towards the 2000s, many Korean people began moving to Korea as marriage migrants, and these marriage migrants were seen as suitable candidates for producing the future children of Korea because they're from the same ethnicities. But towards the latter part of 2000, lower class the migrant workers who are mainly male began moving into Korea, but they share the same languages, but from different class, but the problematic class who are taking jobs away from Korean people. Such negative bias came with that male workers, and they were mainly seen as criminal organizations sometimes. And the status of Chinese migrants are clearly related to the relationship between Korea and China, and they were often stigmatized. I need to start wrapping up. The Korean society is becoming multicultural, and about 5% of our population are foreigners. What is interesting here is the concept of multicultural includes coexistence of multicultural, including pre-existing Korean people, but that kind of original meaning is all but lost in Korea. Of course, there is the original settlers, but versus that, this is mainly used to describe the divide between original people and the migrants. So multicultural in Korea is probably racism in another description. And multicultural became a trend in Korea mainly over the past 40 years. And now Korea has been a single nation for more than 5,000 years, but it has brought about fissure in such imaginary nationalism. And by blending ourselves to other culture, we are still, in part of us, are trying to stick to the previous nationalism. And there is a competition between the new and the old. And diaspora or the Korean expats migrating to Korea, how do they perceive such racism in Korea, and where do they put in this hierarchy? The second thing we can think about is how the Korean people are totally excluded from multicultural constituents in this multiculturalism. The Koreanity or Korean centrism has not been problematized. What do we exactly mean by Korean people? And the Korean multiculturalism, do they really need to be reconstructed into the original form of racism? And last but not least, racism against the foreigners or racism against Korean diasporas is happening because they are migrants. So this word migrant, immigrants, E has been emphasized because E means portability or moving. But 이주민 or Jew is in the character means settling people. So migrants, what do they really need to successfully settle down in the local space? We need to have in-depth discussions into the power structure in this new settling environment. Apologies for spending too much time, but thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee. Of course, all of the panelists needed much more than 10 minutes. Apologies. But last but not least, we would like to ask Professor Lee Sohoon to go next.
Today, I want to talk about doing race in the context of Asian studies, taking my research trajectory as an example and showing how my research interests move from ethnicity-focused to race-focused. So I'm continuing the conversation from the perspective of doing this project at ACWS on gender and race and gender in South Korean context. But focusing on how my research interests move from ethnicity to race. So I finished my PhD 4 years ago on immigration experiences of migrant women in South Korea, particularly marriage migrants and co-ethnic migrants from Vietnam and China. And I want to start by saying that it isn't that I wasn't interested in race per se, because doing so would be difficult for someone who's doing migration studies in North America and Australia, because of the prevalence of the topic of race in those countries. But I think it's precisely this abundance of race literature from the Western context, and in comparison, the dearth of literature in Asian studies context broadly, and Korean studies more specifically, that drove me away from doing race. So now I know the distance I felt during my PhD candidature was my inability to connect a material and historical legacy of a concept of race in the context of my research. Because race is historically rooted and socially specific, race research involves comprehensive studies of historical underpinning, progression, and contemporary manifestation. And I'll speak further about how it's precisely this specificity and historicity of race and inevitable politics such characters and gender that one benefits from doing race. So, but it doesn't mean that I didn't come across possible race research engagement points during my PhD. Some engagements were very compelling. And today I want to revisit a case that I came across during my PhD as I make sense of it from the point of view of doing race, as I am doing right now. And I will take an example of Miss Claudia Kurbanova, a married migrant from Uzbekistan whose picture you're seeing above, who goes by her Korean name Gu Sujin. This photo is of her giving a press conference about an incident of racism that she faced on September 25th, 2011, so 11 years ago. Ms. Gu was barred from entering a public bathhouse where ordinary Koreans go to take a bath, because not all Koreans have bathtubs in their house. And this particular bathhouse was located in Choryangdong, Busan city, and she was barred from entering because she's a foreigner. Ms. Gu is said to have taken out her South Korean ID card because she obtained citizenship after marrying her South Korean husband. But the business owner said that she looked like a foreigner and pointed to a sign that said "No entry to foreigner" at the bathhouse. And the business owner later told the authorities that other Korean customers did not want to share the bathtub with foreigners because of fear that they might catch AIDS. And once he accepted foreign customers, no Korean customers would come. Rightfully indignant, Ms. Gu gave a press conference to problematize her very upsetting experience of discrimination with the help of a local migrant organization. She said that she was taking action for her biracial son, who will have to live in South Korea and may be subjected to such discrimination. The media publicized her case widely. She submitted a case to the National Human Rights Commission of Korea, and the Human Rights Commission made a recommendation 2 months later to both the local government and the business owner telling him not to deny interest to customers based on their race, and for the local government to keep a better monitor. When this story hit the news, I became very interested in this story, and later I went to interview her and the migrant organization staff that is sitting beside her during the press conference. I also went to the area where the public bathhouse was located, Choryangdong. Looking at the incident further, I realized why the bathhouse owner cited the fear of spreading AIDS as a reason for denying entry to foreigners. Next slide, please. Choryangdong is located near the train station and the port, Busan train station and Busan port, and the area is known to locals as Choryangdong, Texas. Texas in Korean means an entertainment district and is often a euphemism for a red light district. Historically, this area was called Chinatown because it used to house a consulate of China's Qing dynasty and businesses targeting Chinese diplomats and people. The Chinese influence waned during the Cold War. Since the 1950s, this area gained the name Texas Town, hosting the American troops. The American troops' presence has declined since the 80s, except for the American Navy that occasionally docks at the Busan port nearby, and you can see the welcome banner when I visited the area. Russian seamen started coming in the 80s, and in addition to them, the area now caters to migrant workers from Southeast Asia since the 2000s. So around the public bathhouse where Ms. Koo sought entry was entertainment shops for the American military, Russians, and migrants from Southeast Asia. The local women's group marks the area as the red light district. In other words, the reason why Ms. Koo faced racial discrimination wasn't because she was just a migrant, but more specifically, definitely not marriage migrant, but because she was mistaken to be a migrant sex worker. Now, how can we look at this incident from the perspective of race? I'm going to focus on three problems. First, it shows the complexity of color and its relationship to race in South Korean's perspective. On the one hand, South Korean society has inherited a sense of white superiority from the West. For example, the Human Rights Commission has produced a recommendation against kindergarten with recruitment ads for white English teachers only. So they're looking for English teachers, but only white ones. On the other hand, South Korean treatment of Russians stresses the need to look at color intersectionally, paying acute attention to ways in which race, gender, country of origin, and class intersect. Tropes of Russian sex workers are of interest here particularly. It's especially compelling that Russian women are brought to serve American servicemen. Secondly, the moral politics of race is worthy of attention. Ms. Koo received a lot of media spotlight because she was a mother and a wife and herself a naturalized citizen. However, migrant entertainment workers in Choryang, Texas town have been made largely invisible from the media spotlight. At the time of Ms. Koo's campaign 11 years ago, migrant entertainment workers who faced daily discrimination in the area were hidden, and the injustice that they faced was taken for granted. In the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of conservative backlash against the discourse of racism and multiculturalism, and the growing discourse of xenophobia propagated by the far-right media. If this had happened today, I think such media would have stressed the immorality and undeservedness of migrants there and discredited Ms. Koo's claim. Nonetheless, what remains constant then and now is a moral politics which determine who deserves not to be discriminated against based on one's gender roles in the family. Thirdly, it points to the racial construction of a word 외국인, which means foreigner in Korean. The sign at the bathhouse said no entry to 외국인, foreigner. And because Ms. Koo thought foreigner meant non-South Korean citizen, she took out her South Korean ID card and appealed that she was a citizen. But for the business owners, 외국인 meant non-Korean or whoever appeared to be non-Korean, specifically Russian or Southeast Asian migrant who could be an entertainment worker. The technicality of citizenship was not significant at all. So these are insights that I have now that I'm doing doing race, so-called doing race, has allowed me to see, especially a superb explanatory ability for multiple layers of power relations here. And I look forward to developing these further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, please show us the next slide. These are we just heard the presentation or discussion by the 3 speakers, and I believe that it was a great time. We were able to understand what was going on. For the next 20 minutes, we'll be raising the common questions. So we've been delayed a little bit, but still, these are the questions that we have prepared, and I believe that in a way, a couple of questions were already answered. So regarding the first questions and second questions are the common questions that will be raised, and then we are going to have the discussions. Afterward, we are going to open the floor and receive questions from the participants. And also, those of you joining us virtually at the same time, physically at the conference room, please use the chatting box of the Zoom, or you can raise your hand and post a question directly if you are physically at the conference room. So let's go to the first question. First question, what does it mean to do race from non-Western perspective or in the Korean society? What is your view on that? Do race. What do you really mean by that in the Korean society or non-Western perspective? So are you asking question to 3 of us? Yes. So can you get rid of this notepad?
네, from my perspective, I guess I'll start because I just talked about doing race from the non-Western perspective. So one of the challenges of doing race from non-Western perspective, and specifically because West is quite broad, and the kind of literature that comes from Europe, for example, or Australia is quite different from the kind of literature that comes from North America, especially the US. So if you say, what does it mean to do race from non-US perspective, I think that speaks to the relative dearth of a literature, because most literature on race comes from the US. But I think I've been thinking how that is limiting how the global race literature is limiting because of the special case that is the US. And while there's been superb literature focusing on the history in the American context, there's been really not enough about the comprehensive history from a global perspective. So not enough about the influence of colonialism in shaping race. And you would expect it, and I know it's been done in silos. So I know there's superb literature coming from Latin American studies, for example, but the colonized societies have not been in conversation with each other. So I think there is really urgent need for, especially colonized societies, to speak to each other. You know, Asians to speak to Asianists needing to speak to Africanists, and Africanists needing to speak to Latin Americanists, because there's a lot of collaborative work that's to be done. From my perspective, what's been difficult about doing race in the Korean studies perspective is really the absence of literature looking at the history, and specifically looking at the impact of Japanese colonialism in the ways in which race in Korea has been in affecting the ways in which race in Korea has been shaped because of the special nature of Japanese colonialism. I think someone talked about it earlier. Japan sort of leading example as a darker races, and Koreans in Japan having very similar racial phenotype. So the challenge of doing race from non-Western perspective is needing to do the historical work despite not being the historian, needing to develop collaborative network, needing to connect with people and scholars from the region where you may not have the expertise. But I think I spoke.
When you ask questions to Korean people individually, they say they are not racists. But race in this context is probably the concept of racism developed in Western countries. But as I've said before, there definitely is racism in Korea based on biological differences or physical differences. There is definitely hatred against people who are different. And the scary thing is that this is gaining momentum in Korea. You could say this is a sort of cultural racism. So in terms of institution or legislation, there are new legislations designed to prevent discrimination or any confusion in Korea. The government is working on this. But when we look at the original Korean people, their cultural racism is becoming increasingly sophisticated and subtle. So in the Korean society, studying race can generate a lot of agendas, but who are the original Korean people? Who are the Korean people? What do you mean by Koreanism? And what is Korean nationality? We need to pay more attention to this, what it really means to be bi Korean. And when we look at our racism against foreign or Korean diasporas gaining root in Korea, even though they are the same ethnicity, but they tend to think their nationalism of Korean diaspora is kind of contaminated. Then what is nationalism that's not contaminated? Is there such thing as non-contaminated nationalism? We have to pay extra attention to this issue, and this is related to the unique characteristics of racism or race in Korea. The studying race in a non-Western society like the Korean society is probably related to why it is important to study race in the Korean society. As the two discussants have said, racism in the Korean society is becoming increasingly complicated, subtle, and hard to observe from outside. We are not blacks and we are not whites. So Asian in the Western definition, even though we are part of the race categories, when we look at Asia, there is a far more complicated racial discrimination in play in Asia. They are not often described as racism, so it is often treated as non-existent or less urgent, or a phenomena that is not evident or urgent in the Korean society. So they are often not evident. I think this is really important to conceptualizing racism and race in the Korean society. And Asia is the largest continent in the world, and we cannot paint the entire Asian continent with a broad brush. Asian from the American perspective could make up one racial category, and Filipino women and Korean men getting married and their children are not seen as multiracial or interracial people in the American society. But in Korea, they are treated as separate racial group like Croatian quotient in Korea. They are treated as multicultural people. The way we are racialized in Korea is far more complicated in Korea. It's not merely related to the country of origin or the color of your skin. There are far more complicated factors in play in Korea. What kind of concept we need or how we should approach this issue requires much more in-depth discussions and research. And studying race in a non-Western society like the Korean society is going to be far more complicated and should be able to deal with the peculiar characteristics of Asia as a region. So we need to focus on the Asian aspect of such race and racialism. Thank you very much. As you have mentioned in your individual presentations and based on your comments that we heard in this panel discussion, we can see some intersectionality. Professor Lee has pointed out that we need common research into countries that have been the subject of colonial rule, and we desperately need more research in this kind of race and racism. And Professor Lee has talked about the hatred against the difference, like getting root in the Korean society. And Professor Kim has also said, how should we define the Korean woman in the contemporary society? And how has the characteristics or identity of Korean women evolved over time? This is related to the second question that we have prepared. Of course, we could be repeating some of the discussions, but since we are talking about the peculiar geopolitical characteristics in issues related to collaborations on race and gender, I think we need to extend such discussions further. When we look at the theories and methodologies developed in Korea and non-Western societies, how do you think, how does the West mean in the studies of race from non-Western societies?
I guess on the second question, my question is it possible to provincialize race research from the U.S., right? So I am, homage to Chakrabarty, whether we can provincialize Europe, because each society has to evaluate a specific historical moment that was fundamental to the ways in which race is constructed. And for the U.S., that historical moment would be something like, the slavery, civil rights movement, etc. And other societies would have their own defining historical moments, and this is what I mean by the American case being what is a more of an exception because of its sort of distant relevance to colonialism, whereas colonialism, imperialism, I would imagine would be more fundamental to these defining moments in other parts of a country. In other words, there has to be, the core text in my ideal intellectual world would come from the colonized society or formerly decolonizing societies, right? From which you can build connections on the shared experiences of colonialism and imperialism. And that hasn't been the case, so that's still it still remains a dilemma as to whether we can provincialize some of the so-called leading the core text in race studies coming from the U.S.
In my case, regarding the second and third questions, I'd like to express my views. Probably my discussion will be quite lengthy, but please understand that when I give you answer, I'll be answering the questions of number 2 and 3. The feminism study, the space and location could be critical, and there could be various theories and also the issue of the scale, and also there are different methods and different tools and different theories, especially in studying immigration and also gender and race. Especially focusing on the immigration, it could give a great implication. Frankly speaking, feminisms and gender studies, the concept of space in a very early stage has been used, I believe. For example, the issue of the border or boundary, or internal or external of the borders, in many concepts came into being. So, in a way, these concepts were like a metaphor, and it has widened our imaginary world, and also it has expanded our interest in doing the research. However, the concept of human geography existed only as a concept. Not only that, but also in the geospatial location, there are a lot of interest that it has actually been implemented. Let me give you another example. The nationalisms or social studies, when we think about that, the space or location provide only a background when we do the studies in the race or immigrations. For example, like administration, segmentations, it only provide a background, but the space, phenomena of the race and immigration, all three are closely connected and they give influence among themselves. So once again, they are reborn as another space. In English word, there's a take place, quote and unquote. Take place means something, some kind of event occurred or happened. And take place, when we put location at the end of take place at the location, that means the gender or the race happened because at a certain locations a certain event happened. So location could provide as a cause or a justification. So we need to analyze the location, or sometimes location could be the target of our theoretical reflection. And in that context, we need to understand that. In relations with the gender issue, now the space could be understood as a main mechanism of suppressing women. There are a lot of studies about that. For example, the house or home is not a comfortable place to live, but rather a place where violence can occur, or a spatial limitations, or sometimes there are a lot of studies that restrict women within the boundary of a house or a home. But at the same time, the home or house could be the tool of liberation or a tool for finding a new exit, paragonous or theory. There are a lot of discourse about this. I'll give another example. Immigrant women, they are the subject of the mixed voices that are located at the boundary. They not only exist internally inside the boundary, but also outside the boundary, and they keep expressing their mixed voices. So as the subject within the society or community, when we analyze their races and their gender, definitely with a high resolution, we can understand their existence. Last week, I went to Singapore, and Port Canning Park exists in the downtown area of Singapore. The reason why I visited this park is because the helper, the cleaners of the domestic workers that came from Myanmar gather at this park during the weekend. So Port Canning is a very low hill. The height is below less than 100 meter. In the western part of this hill, there were like a playground. There are very small scale zoo, a place where white family visit and enjoy picnic. So it poked my curiosity, and I couldn't find where is the gathering place of these domestic workers. So I went to the eastern part of the hill. I was able to find the domestic workers who came from Myanmar who were gathered and enjoying their weekend there. And the parties that they do here and there during the weekend. Also, there were male workers who came from Myanmar, and then they meet together there at the park. They were enjoying their weekend. So watching them, I realized that they are enjoying their weekend enclave. And this is so-called a local. And from the scale perspective, there's a global capitalism. I could see how it is operated and how it transcends the boundary and how it deeply was rooted in the lower classes, but also from the national perspective, the country called Singapore. I mean, there are a lot of different kinds of the rules and regulations, and also social rules exist that prohibits or sometimes regulates the immigrant workers. But still, these immigrant workers, they work at the Singapore household and they enjoy weekend enclave. So I was able to enjoy different things and how these immigrant workers were subject to the restraint in the white family members or in a Singaporean national household. So these are not opposing concept, but rather it's a overlapping concept. And Doreen Massey, one of the geologists from the UK, his theory was very helpful in understanding this. So once again, the concept of local and also different scales of the complicated issues were also unbundled. And local is a very specific place. So I guess we need to pay more attention to the concept of local so that we can do the research on the race and gender. And it could be helpful in doing race and gender research in Korea as well.
In studying race in a non-Western society like the Korean society, what kind of impact does the Western methodologies have? That is the question we are dealing with now. And the Western theories, how should we challenge the Western-centered theories? Well, even Western communities are different from each other, and that's an area where we should focus on. When we talk about racism, American racism is definitely different from the European racism because of many different contexts. So we cannot just broadly call them Western societies. And various race or racism-related discourse, is it unilaterally flowing from the West to Asia? That is the agenda for my personal research. And the global market for surrogate mothers or reproduction structure is an area I am interested in. Like white person from the Western society are trying to purchase eggs from the egg market in India. And the racism or race in play in this kind of global market is different, probably is source of creation of tensions between different notions of racism between the West and non-Western communities. And sometimes the companies that sell such eggs reflect the concept of race from white consumers and end up reproducing the notion of race that white people have. So how does the what related notions are shifting? That is something that we need to do more research on. Thank you very much. The discussants have given us a lot of inspiration. Professor Lee Sohoon has talked about American-centered race and racism and theories, how we can discern ourselves from them, and there is a dilemma here. And Professor Kim has talked about how various racism has power play in Asia, how the migrant domestic workers in Singapore are finding themselves in the hierarchy in Singapore. And Professor Kim has talked about how the egg consumers in Asia are treating the other Asian providers, and very sophisticated and subtle racism that is taking place in Asian society now. Now we are going to open the floor to the audience. So we are joined by participants offline and online, and we would like to encourage you to participate in the discussion. First of all, Dr. Olivia Ritas-Bois has given us a question, and let me share that with you. Let me summarize the question. Professor Ruta Dubois has said that this presentation is highly stimulating, and I am compelled to continue the conversation on the idea of practice of racism and sense of belonging, and how the sense of belonging plays with racism to create various theories and actions, and the ethnicity, the role of ethnicities, as well as the coming back from elsewhere and migration. The way I try to fight racism in Belgium or UK, Europe is often by pointing at how irrelevant it should be where someone is from. And her question is how the Korean experience and context indeed pushes us to be more precise on the role of ethnicities as well as coming back from elsewhere and migration. And the way I try to and the returning diasporas that Professor Lee has talked about, compare that in dealing with blacks or other people of color, how the Korean people react or how the Korean people react to white, how that is structured. Thank you very much, Professor Rita Jibois. Am I supposed to answer the question? You don't have to, but yes, you're welcome to give the first shot at answering the question.
간단히 말씀드리겠습니다. 한국에서의 인종주의는
Racism in Korea
생물학적인 그런 특성과 상관이 있죠.
is definitely related to physical traits, but that is not the only ones at play here.
필요가 있을 것 같습니다. 생물학적인 특성에 근거한 인종주의는
Racism based on biological or physical traits, they are not quite different from that found in Western societies.
경험한 것들 이런 것들을 간단히 말씀드리면
Let me share some of my personal experiences with you. When I was in high school, there was a student of biracial origin, and there were the black and white students. At that time, our uniform was black, and both these biracial students wore the same black uniform. But those who was black was really discriminated against. The white biracial students, we didn't care about them really. Of course, they looked different, and students reacted to that, but there was no distinct discrimination against the white biracial students. I heard how they have done after school, but I don't want to share that with you now. But definitely there was clear differentiation in terms of discrimination against the black biracial and white biracial students. And discriminating against returning diasporas have nothing to do with physical traits. Of course, some Korean people who lived a long time in China might have special or unique accents in their way of speaking, or the way of their culture could be distinct. And that could be the cause for discrimination. But obviously, apparently, they don't look different from Korean people. But in spite of that, such discrimination does exist. And why is that the case? When we talk about diasporas and definitions of diasporas, well, there are Korean people living overseas. They are called Korean diasporas. And when the way Korean people think about these diasporas is quite strongly related to nationalistic sentiment, like Korean people are living all over the world. And they're quite friendly and supportive to diasporas overseas. And like Korean people have opened Korean language schools in northern region of China for Korean people to study Korean language in China. The government actually supports such opening of schools, and most of the Korean people support such activities. But peculiarly, very strange thing is when they come back to Korea, they become discriminated against because they are trying to live among us, and their difference becomes more evident in our daily lives. And that probably becomes the cause for discrimination. So our version of racism is quite unique, which is difficult to be explained with the Western theories of racism. Yes, I think I have been all over the place, but that's all I have to say for now. Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Professor Kim, Professor Lee, do you have anything to add to that? So we are running out of time. So why don't we collect and merge some of the other questions? Yes. Also, we would love to receive a question offline from the audience. Do you have any questions from the audience? If you have one, please raise your hand. Yes, we have a lot of questions. Professor Lee, could you designate the person who will be asking the question? Yes.
Thank you so much for this fascinating panel. My name is Beatrice Alupo, and I'm a PhD candidate from Griffith University. First of all, I would like to start by saying that labeling intersectionality approach as a Black feminist theory is something that shouldn't be actually there. And then the aspect of race, how do I pronounce your name? Is it Yin? Yi? Yeah, you were able to eliminate ethnicities from your study because you were studying only maybe people from Asia. So if you come to Africa, there is no way you can eliminate race. You cannot eliminate ethnicity from race because we are Africans, but we have in that race, we have different languages, we have different cultures. So there is no way you're going to eliminate that. So basically having race, the difference we have race from race from the American aspect is because they are blacks and they are white. But when you cross that, race is more than just being black and white. So my question goes to Kim. From your discussion, you are mainly emphasized on bisexual and sexual harassment. So my question, like now, what is the state of other women in Korea? Because that's what we are looking at. Are we now having women in Korea at the same, sitting on the same table as men, like in the political aspect? What is the state of the Korean women against men? And within the Korean women themselves, don't we have other differences on how these women are treated, or women even just, because as women, we have different classes of women. Say, look at women with disability. Are they benefiting at the same as a woman who is not having a disability? A woman who is not educated? How are these differences in the Korean aspect? Then I'll go to Lee. And you've emphasized your aspect on the racialism in Korea, mainly based on the discrimination from the local population to other races in Korea. So are there no discriminatory policies against other maybe migrants, or even like when you look at, say, the Korean Chinese? Are we all treated the same as Korean? Are you all treated the same as Koreans? Because more you're talking about, like, it's, yes, the government is doing its best to prevent racial discrimination in Korea, but are laws in Korea all this uniform? Say, like, if you're a foreigner, you earn the same, or you get the job as the same as a Korean? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Fortunately, we seem to have a lot of questions from the floor, so we would like to collect some more questions before we ask our panelists to respond to the questions. Our roundtable started 5 minutes later, so if it is okay, I hope we can continue this session until 4:45. Next question, please raise your hand if you have the next question.
My question is for Professor Lee. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very insightful. But I was very curious to know, what are the possibilities for the assimilation of second or third gen Joseonjeok families in Korea? Like, does the discrimination prolong for the next generations, or is it something that is only associated for the first generation? Thank you so much.
And please.
Thank you for the discussion. I find the discussion very relevant coming from Japan, and I'd like to ask how do you find the working of the neoliberal diversity management works to make invisible the racism in a way, and also legitimating the racism in some way. For example, in Japan, there are, younger generation find the Korean culture a lot, very interesting and very, fascinating. But also at the same time, it seems to, make some historical racism invisible, and also legitimate some racism, some forms of racism as justified, like saying that, oh, we find Korean culture quite fascinating, but also but some of them are really, making the use of the the claim of racism as in the form of the really political way of attacking Japan. So I think it's really troublesome to see this kind of the cultural how to say appreciation of the Korean culture as at the same time in a way to legitimate some form of historical amnesia and legitimating some form of racism. So I'd like to hear, I don't know, maybe some of you might address this question. Thank you.
Yes, to the left, a lady with short hair. Hello, I'm from Ewha University. I'm a PhD candidate student. My name is Kim Hyo-jung. And the panelists have talked about a new paradigm, creation of new paradigm for racial discourse in the Korean community. And I've learned a lot, and I look forward to your continued research in the related field, and very much interested in how this expands to other discussions about race and racism in the Korean society. My question is this: identity-based politics. And as part of that, I thought this was part of a research into race. And how about racial studies from the political economic studies perspective? In the Korean society, when we look at the ratio of foreigners, Kyungpook, they tend to have the highest percentage of foreign population because of the refugee migrants and also migrant workers who are working in various manufacturing service industries or care workers. So among the foreigners communities, there is a big difference between registered people, non-registered people. So any methodologies or research areas for the different constituents of foreign population in Korea? This will be the last question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello, professors. My name is Lisa Ho, and I'm from SOAS University of London. I have a quite short question. How do you explain discrimination in South Korean society towards North Koreans in terms of race, location, identity, culture, history, nationalism? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for the important questions. I think we have about 10 minutes. So we have only limited time, but I would like to give the floor to the panelists.
Thank you for your questions and comments. So I'm going to address the question on the chat box, as well as the first question and I think the last question. So what I'm interested in this project is looking at historical continuity in the construction of race, because race is constructed, but we don't know exactly how it is constructed. And actually, to look at race as a construction, because it's a historically specific and socially contextualized phenomenon, it takes a lot from you. You cannot just simply rely on a text from the intersectionality text from Black feminists in the American context. There has to be more socially specific and historical specific research into it. So I think it's actually a large endeavor, and I'm really glad for the project team to be undertaking some of those endeavors. So I'm interested in historical continuity of it, namely how did South Korea get this concept of race. Like, where did it come about, and how did it come about, and how does it affect the present? And on the basis of it, and I'm not a historian, so I'm relying on other members of a couple research initiative that I'm part of at the moment to undertake this, to tackle this research problem. And secondly, how does what that tells us, the continuity from the past to the present, what does that tell us about the research of race from Korean studies / Asian studies / non-Western studies perspective, right? So that's a question that I want to tackle. And I think it's very easy to say Korea is a special case, and racism in Korea is very special. It's very crazy. It's very hard to understand because Koreans are most racist against, Joseon족, ethnic Koreans from China, North Korean defectors. They're not even different ethnicity. They're the same ethnicity, but why are they racialized, right? So I am interested in, looking at the history and social development since the colonialism, since the idea of race first came about. So to answer the first question, I'm not interested in eliminating ethnicity. I'm interested in looking at the explanatory power of race, especially when it comes to explaining power relationship and complex layers of power relationships. And that's how you can explain, Russian people also appear white, and American troops are also white. So what are the layers of whiteness there? What are the layers of the ways in which North Koreans, South Koreans, and Korean Chinese are racialized? What are the layers of marriage migrants being racialized or being brought in to bear South Korean-looking child, right? So those are the kind of things that I hope to be able to achieve from this initiative. And a lot of it comes from building historical continuous studies on the ways in which race came to exist and how that affects, and also answering, the context of neoliberalism. I mean, neoliberalism is a contemporary manifestation of capitalism, yeah? So of course that it's manifest in the ways in which Koreans treat migrant workers from Southeast Asia and South Asia and why they are brought in here in the first place. But is it really separable from the older versions of capitalism, of imperial capitalism, colonial capitalism, right? So that's the kind of question that I want to explore further. Thank you.
Well, hatred and discrimination found in the Korean society and the diasporas who are being targeted by such racism, well, we need to pay special attention to the fact that how the people who are targeted by this hatred are pushing back or responding to such hatred. Because there is a lot of interesting lessons to learn from here. And I have said before that in the Korean multiculturalism, it does not include any discussion about original Korean people. It's as if racism in the Western culture did not consider white people, but they're beginning to do it only now. So multicultural discourse, for it to be established as an institution, well, Joseon족, or the Korean ethnic people from China, account for the largest share, and they push back. They don't want to be considered in multicultural categories. They don't agree that they need to be categorized as multicultural people, and they continuously resist that. But when we look at how they try to settle in Korea, they have to come to face with the status they have in the Korean society, like they're being treated as a low-class migrant workers, and they try to carry out strategies that's more realistic and pragmatic. And one of the strategies they choose is to make it obvious that we are multicultural people. And by being multicultural, they get extra support from the Korean government. Let's say in the largest Joseon족 community in Korea resides in Daerimdong area, and when you go to Daerimdong neighborhood, they try to develop this region as their own familiar and convenient place of settlement. And one of their efforts is, of course, they don't want to be labeled as multicultural, but they just make it obvious that there are multicultural shops or businesses. And Daerimdong, of course, is becoming a ghetto or place of constraints, but it's also becoming a place of rebellion or resistance. And resistance against discrimination. And I think they're developing a new form of identity. Discrimination against Joseon족, does it transcend generations? Well, it boils down how their differences are disclosed. The first generation Joseon족, it is obvious that they're different. Their way of speaking, their customs or daily lives, it's obvious that they're different. But in the second generation, they lose their accent and they become part of Korean societies. And they try not to make it obvious that they're Joseon족. They don't need to. So they become naturalized Korean citizens. And they are being considered as Korean people, but at certain point in time, when they become stigmatized as a diaspora, they suffer a lot. Regarding discrimination against North Korean defectors, well, this is, I think, a very unique characteristics in Korea because of the unique geographical characteristics that only Korea has around the world. Of course, the Korean government provides a lot of support for North Korean defectors, but the problem is not with the legislation or institution. It all comes from cultural differences because we have cultural racism fully active in the Korean society. So North Korean defectors are often frustrated and they try to rebel against it. Many North Korean defectors have chosen to leave South Korea for another place because of this discrimination. We are seeing a great increase in the number of migrants. You have talked about Umsong in Kyungpook area. In the field of geography that I study, we are very much interested in local mechanism in certain regions, and we are seeing a lot of changes these days. Recently, many female workers are working in the agricultural industry, and Kunsan in Chungcheongnam-do area is very unique, and Kumsan is known for sesame leaves, mass production of sesame leaves, and in order to pick sesame leaves, we have a lot of female workers working in Kumsong to pick sesame leaves, and Kumsong has seen a rapid rise in the number of female migrant workers. So when you take a detailed look at the local trends from the perspective of scale of geography, they are all interrelated. So we can look at both the global and local trends there. Thank you very much.
Due to the limited time, please give us a wrap-up comment really quickly. Yes, I know that we are behind the schedule. I'll be very brief. It was very interesting and also exciting questions. I'd like to point two things and then I will wrap up. Today we are talking mainly about race, but what about the role of ethnicity? Without ethnicity, there was no questions about that, but I guess there are much room for us to discuss and exchange views regarding ethnicity. Whenever I write things in English, I don't know how to translate this homogeneity, ethnicity. So in Korea, we talk about nationalism, but how shall we translate that into Korean? There are a lot of different ways to translate that. But if you look at race from the perspective of Western society, in a way, there are areas that's really hard to interpret precisely. And one of that example is homogeneity or homogeneous nationality. So as much as race is difficult to work on, I guess ethnicity is difficult to approach and to do research on. And also in relations with the women in Korea, there were questions about that. Let me briefly mention about that. Currently, Kim Ji-young, born in 1982, the book that became bestseller, has emerged as an icon. The character of Kim Ji-young belongs to the middle class, received university education, and form a family, and she's not a handicapped person with no disability at all. So most average women or could be regarded as the most representative feminism women. And then from the perspective of immigrant women, how can we approach this? How can we interpret this? So I think we need to ponder that upon together. So in the research of gender or feminism, we need to understand the discourse of the hegemonic approach toward the existing theory. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. As many people have pointed out today, race and genders are interrelated with each other. Gender becomes probably a cause for racism, issues of ethnicities, disabilities, religious backgrounds, or legislative legal status. All of these factors interplay and are interlocked to create racism. Throughout the past year, we have discussed so many issues, and it was a great pleasure to share these issues with you. And the questions and the comments that you have shared with us will be great incentives for us to carry on our research for the next year. And we wish to continue to see you in the reception. And over the next few days, I hope we can engage in in-depth discussions of this sort. And the various discussions that we have carried out is all part of our efforts to create the society that we all want to live in, and what kind of interventions and actions we need to take to create that kind of desirable society for peaceful coexistence. I think we will have to continue to do our best in our respective fields, lecturing, research, and various areas. I would like to thank everyone in the audience, panelists, and organizers. I wish you have a good evening. Thank you very much.